Well, we're back here at the Caribou Public Library for our chapter book story time. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Miss Erin, and we are continuing to read Bambi. We're on chapter 9 of Bambi by Felix Sultan, illustrated by Gerard Goodenow. All right, so chapter 9 begins like this. Bambi noticed that the world was changed. It was hard for him to get used to this altered world. They had all lived like rich folk, and now had fallen upon hard times. For Bambi knew nothing but abundance. He took it for granted that he would always have plenty to eat. He thought he would never need to trouble about food. He believed he would always sleep in the lovely green-leafed glade, where no one could see him, and would always go about in his smooth, handsome, glossy red coat. Now, everything was changed without his having noticed the changing take place. The process that was ending had seemed only a series of episodes to him. It pleased him to see the milk-white veils of mist steam from the meadow in the morning, or drop suddenly from the gray sky at dawn. They vanished so beautifully in the sunshine. The hoar-frost that covered the meadow with such dazzling whiteness delighted him too. Sometimes he liked to listen to his big cousins, the elks. The whole forest would tremble with their kingly voices. Bambi used to listen and be very much frightened, but his heart would beat high with admiration when he heard them calling. He remembered that the kings had antlers branching like tall, strong trees. And it seemed to him that their voices were as powerful as their antlers. Whenever he heard the deep tones of those voices, he would stand motionless. Their deep voices rolled toward him like the mighty moaning of noble, maddened blood, whose primal power was giving utterance to longing, rage, and pride. Bambi struggled in vain against his fears. They overpowered him whenever he heard those voices, but he was proud to have such noble relatives. At the same time, he felt a strange sense of annoyance because they were so unapproachable. It offended and humiliated him without his knowing exactly how or why, even without his being particularly conscious of it. It was only after the mating season had passed that the thunder of the stag's mighty voices had grown still, that Bambi began to notice other things once more. At night, when he roamed through the forest, or by day as he lay in the glade, he heard the falling leaves whisper among the trees. They fluttered and rustled ceaselessly through the air from all the treetops and branches. A delicate, silvery sound was falling constantly to earth. It was wonderful to awaken amidst it, wonderful to fall asleep to this mysterious and melancholy whispering. Soon, the leaves lay thick and loose on the ground, and when you walked through them, they flew about, softly rustling. It was jolly to push them aside with every step. They were piled so high. It made a sound like shh, shh, soft and very clear and silvery. Besides, it was very useful, for Bambi had to be particularly careful these days to hear and smell everything. And with the leaves, you could hear everything far off. They rustled at the slightest touch and cried, shh, shh, shh. Nobody could steal through them. But then the rain came. It poured down from early morning till late at night. Sometimes it rained all night long and into the following day. It would stop for a while and begin again with fresh strength. The air was damp and cold. The whole world seemed full of rain. If you tried to nibble a little meadow grass, you got your mouth full of water. Or if you tugged the least bit at a bow, a whole torrent of water poured into your eyes and nose. The leaves no longer rustled. They lay pale and soggy on the ground, flattened by the rain, and made no sounds. Bambi discovered for the first time how unpleasant it is to be rained on all day and all night, until you're soaked to the skin. There had not even been a frost yet, but he longed for the warm weather and felt that it was a sad business to have to run around, all soaked through. But when the north wind blew, Bambi found out what cold is. It wasn't much help to nestle close to his mother. Of course, at first he thought it was wonderful to lie there and keep one side warm at least, but the north wind raged through the forest all day and all night long. It seemed to be driven to madness by some incomprehensible ice-cold fury. as though it wanted to tear up the forest by its roots or annihilate it somehow. The trees groaned in stubborn resistance. They struggled mightily against the wind's fierce onslaught. You could hear their long drawn-out moans, their sigh-like creakings, the loud snap when their strong limbs split, the angry cracking when now and again a trunk broke and the vanquished tree seemed to shriek from every wound in its rent and dying body. Nothing else could be heard, for the storm swooped down still more fiercely on the forest, and its roaring drowned all lesser noises. Then Bambi knew that want and hardship had come. He saw how much the rain and wind had changed the world. There was no longer a leaf on tree or shrub, but all stood there as though violated, their bodies naked for all to see. And they lifted their bare brown limbs to the sky for pity. The grass on the meadow was withered and shortened, as if it had sunk into the earth. Even the glade seemed wretched and bare. Since the leaves had fallen, it was no longer possible to lie so well hidden as before. The glade was open on all sides. One day, as a young magpie flew over the meadow, something cold and white fell in her eye. Then it fell again and again. She felt as if a little veil were drawn across her eye, while the small, pale, blinding white flakes danced around her. The magpie hesitated in her flight, fluttered a little, and then soared straight up into the air. In vain. The cold white flakes were everywhere and got into her eye again. She kept flying straight up, soaring higher. "Don't put yourself out so much, dearie," a crow who was flying above her in the same direction called down. "Don't put yourself out so much. You can't fly high enough to get outside these flakes. This is snow." "Snow?" cried the magpie in surprise, struggling against the drizzle. "That's about the size of it," said the crow. "It's winter, and this is snow." "Excuse me," the magpie replied, "but I only left the nest in May. I don't know anything about winter." "There are plenty in the same boat," the crow remarked, "but you'll soon find out." "Well," said the magpie, "if this is snow, I guess I'll sit down for a while." She perched on an elder and shook herself. The crow flew awkwardly away. At first, Bambi was delighted with the snow. The air was calm and mild, while the white snow stars swirled down and the world looked completely different. It had grown lighter, gayer, Bambi thought, and whenever the sun came out for a little while, everything shone and the white covering flashed and sparkled so brightly that it blinded you. But soon, Bambi stopped being pleased with the snow, for it grew harder and harder to find food. He had to paw the snow away with endless labor before he could find one withered little blade of grass. Here is a picture of these two birds in the sky. The crow and the magpie. The snow crust cut his legs, and he was afraid of cutting his feet. Gobo had already cut his. Of course, Gobo was the kind who couldn't stand anything and was a constant source of trouble to his mother. The deer were always together now and were much more friendly than before. Enna brought her children constantly. Lately, Marina, a half-grown doe, had joined the circle, but old Netla really contributed most to their entertainment. She was quite a self-sufficient person and had her own ideas about everything. "No," she would say, "I don't bother with children any more. I've had enough of that particular joke." Faline asked, "What difference does it make if they're a joke?" And Netla would act as if she were angry and say, "They're a bad joke, though, and I've had enough of them." They got along perfectly together. They would sit side by side gossiping. The young ones had never had a chance to hear so much. Even one or another of the princes would join them now. At first, things went somewhat stiffly, especially since the children were a little shy. But that soon changed, and they got along very well together. Bambi admired Prince Rono, who was a stately lord, and he passionately loved the handsome young Scarce. They had dropped their horns, and Bambi often looked at the two stately gray, round spots that showed smooth and shimmering, with many delicate points on the princes' heads. They looked very noble. It was terribly interesting whenever one of the princes talked about him. Rono had a thick hide covered swelling on his left forefoot. He limped on that foot and used to ask sometimes, "Can you really see that I limp?" Everyone would hasten to assure him that there was not a trace of a limp. That was what Rono wanted, and it really was hardly noticeable. "Yes," he would go on, "I saved myself from a tight corner that time." And then Rono would tell how he had surprised him and hurled his fire at him. But it had only struck his leg. It had driven him nearly mad with pain, and no wonder, since the bone was shattered. But Rono did not lose his head. He was up and away on 3 legs. He pressed on in spite of his weakness, for he saw that he was being pursued. He ran without stopping until night came. Then he gave himself a rest. But he went on the next morning until he felt that he was in safety. He took care of himself, living alone in hiding, waiting for his wound to heal. At last he came out again, and he was a hero. He limped, but he thought no one noticed it. They were often together now for long periods, and told many stories. Bambi heard more about him than ever before. They told how terrible he was to look at. No one could bear to look at his pale face. Bambi knew that already from his own experience. They spoke too about his smell, and again Bambi could have spoken if he had not been too well brought up to mix in his elders' conversation. They said that his smell differed each time in 100 subtle ways, and yet you could tell it in an instant, for it was always exciting, unfathomable, mysterious, and terrible. They told how he used only 2 legs to walk with, and they spoke of the amazing strength of his 2 hands. Some of them did not know what hands were, but when it was explained, old Netla said, "I don't see anything so surprising in that. A squirrel can do everything you tell about just as well, and every little mouse can perform the same wonders." She turned away her head disdainfully. "Oh, no," cried the others, and they gave her to understand that those were not the same things at all. But old Netla was not to be cowed. "What about the falcon?" she exclaimed, "and the buzzard and the owl? They've got only 2 legs, and when they want to catch something, they simply stand on one leg and grab it with the other. That's much harder, and he certainly can't do that." Old Netla was not at all inclined to admire anything connected with him. She hated him with all her heart. "He is loathsome," she said, and she stuck to that. Besides, nobody contradicted her, since nobody liked him. But the talk grew more complicated when they told how he had a 3rd hand, not 2 hands merely, but a 3rd hand. "That's an old story," Netla said curtly. "I don't believe it." "Is that so?" Rono broke in. "Then what did he shatter my leg with? Can you tell me that?" Netla answered carelessly. "That's your affair, my dear. He's never shattered any of mine." Aunt Enna said, "I've seen a good deal in my time. I think there's something in the story that he has a 3rd hand." "I agree with you," young Karis said politely. "I have a friend, a crow." He paused, embarrassed for a moment, and then looked around at them, one after another, as though he were afraid of being laughed at. But when he saw that they were listening attentively to him, he went on. "This crow is unusually well-informed, I must say that. Surprisingly well-informed. And she says that he really has 3 hands, but not always. The 3rd hand is the bad one, the crow says. It isn't attached like the other 2, but he carries it hanging over his shoulder. The crow says that she can always tell exactly when he, or anyone like him, is going to be dangerous. If he comes without the 3rd hand, then he isn't dangerous." Old Netla laughed. "Your crow's a blockhead, my dear Karis," she said. "Tell her so for me. If she were as clever as she thinks she is, she'd know that he's always dangerous. Always." But the others had different objections. Bambi's mother said, "Some of them aren't dangerous. You can see that at a glance." "Is that so?" old Netla asked. "I suppose you still stand until they come up to you and wish you a good day?" Bambi's mother answered gently, "Of course I don't stand still. I run away." And Feline broke in with, You should always run away." Everybody laughed. But then they talked about the third hand, and they became serious, and fear grew on them, gradually. For whatever it might be, a third hand or something else, it was terrible, and they did not understand it. They only knew of it from other stories. Few of them had ever seen it for themselves. He would stand still, far off, and never move. You couldn't explain what he did or how it happened, but suddenly there would be a crash like thunder. Fire would shoot out, and far away from him you would drop down dying with your breast torn open. They all sat bowed when they talked about him, as though they felt the presence of some dark, unknown power controlling them. They listened curiously to the many stories that were always horrible, full of blood and suffering. They listened tirelessly to everything that was said about him. Tales that were certainly invented, all the stories and sayings that had come down from their fathers and great-grandfathers. In each of them, they were unconsciously seeking for some way to propitiate this dark power, or some way to escape it. "What difference does it make," young Kara said, quite despondently, "how far away he is when he kills you?" "Didn't your clever crow explain that to you?" old Netla mocked. "No," said Karis with a smile. "She says that she's often seen him, but no one can explain him." "Yes, he knocks the crows out of the trees too, when he wants to," Rono observed, "and brings down the pheasant on the wing," Aunt Enna added. Bambi's mother said, "He throws his hand at you. My grandmother told me so." "Is that so?" asked old Netla. "What is it that bangs so terribly then?" "That's when he tears his hand off," Bambi's mother explained, "and the fire flashes and the thunder cracks. He's all fire inside." "Excuse me," said Rono. "It's true that he's all fire inside, but that about his hand is wrong. A hand couldn't make such wounds. You can see that for yourself. It's more likely that it's a tooth that he throws at us. A tooth would explain a great many things, you know. You really die from his bite." "Would you never stop hunting, or will he never stop hunting us?" young Karis sighed. Then Marina spoke, the young half-grown doe. "They say that sometime he will come to live with us and be as gentle as we are. He'll play with us, and then the whole forest will be happy, and we'll be friends with him." Old Netla burst out laughing. "Let him stay where he is and leave us in peace," she said. Aunt Enna said reprovingly, "You shouldn't talk that way." "And why not?" old Netla replied hotly. "I really don't see why not. Friends with him! He's murdered us ever since we can remember. Every one of us. Our sisters, our mothers, our brothers. Ever since we came into the world, he's given us no peace, but has killed us whenever we showed our heads. And now we're going to be friends with him? What nonsense!" Marina looked at all of them out of her big, calm, shining eyes. "Love is no nonsense," she said. "It has to come." Old Netla turned away. "I'm going to look for something to eat," she said, and trotted off. And that is the end of chapter 9. A long one. All right, well, goodbye for today. We'll see you next time.